So I've been listening to and deciphering the sonorities of dialectal Italianità, proverbs, stories, songs, since I was a kid. And it's that conflicted soundscape and the need to understand it that directly led to my life's vocation: Italian and Italian diaspora, oral culture, and oral history. During the early 1980s, I began puzzling over the missing folk music revival amongst post-World War II diaspora Italians in Toronto, which is my community, while doing a PhD in UCLA's Italian department, having just discovered this musical underground myself, and totally fortuitously. At that time, it was the 80s, I surveyed Toronto's musical scene, its varieties, sites, events, and the factors impacting its Italian traditional music, and that was published in 1994 in the Journal of Canadian Studies. Why had this music been negated and suppressed? I changed my literary to folklore studies and began advocating for folk music, predicting that it would play a key role in diasporic cultural reclamation. These forgotten sounds and silenced voices, I argued, needed to speak and sing directly to our ears and to our hearts for that to happen. We had to dig deep and put these sounds back in circulation. So key did I believe them to be that I made this my professional mission for the next 30 years. I began collecting in the Pavia area of Italy. This was a recording with Albatross Records that we did with the Regione Lombardia. In Toronto, as part of my dissertation, I was surveying the Italian musical presence in Toronto. And I did more field work. So these are some of the things that came out of that work. And this was the dissertation, the work done in L'Appennino Pavese. And then I did more field work in Puglia. And I learned to beat the drum, literally and figuratively. This was at the Istituto Italiano di Cultura. In order to become, as Christine Zinni calls us, a cantastorie, a story singer of our ethnographic past. So I began to teach Italian folklore at UCLA and eventually founded and directed the nonprofit Italian Oral History Institute in Los Angeles, which was closed in 2007, primarily to bridge academic and public sector through conferences, publications, and public programs in Los Angeles. This was some of the teaching that I did, and Italian traditional song anthology translated from the dialects into English for a general public. So, let me see. I often felt like a one-woman band. I carefully managed the message, the style, and venues to give the project gravitas. Not a folklore, but a history institute. And we worked in mainstream museums, universities, and Italian organizations. We had some fairly progressive directors, Italian cultural directors in those days, and consuls. I won't say more. I countered this approach, what we call ethnic display events, with this. No costumes, no choreographed dance troupes or red, white, and green. That's not to denigrate that form of folklore performance. It has its place. I just wasn't interested. But that's a topic of another paper. We did some very innovative and progressive programming for the times, and I'll show you some of that later. My political direction became increasingly activist. At first, it was part vindication of the hidden ancestral culture of an entire migrant class, that is my own. But beyond that, I felt called to promote better global citizenship, social justice, and cultural equity, in tune with a wider transnational Italian and a global South movement. Little did I know in 1994 how profoundly things would begin changing in the very next few years into a full-fledged Italian folk revival movement. It was thrilling to facilitate a small part of that. So what happened? Before addressing the why, when, where, who, and how of these revival movements, though, allow me to historically contextualize diaspora musical matters. Where Italians dispersed from the pre- and post-unification, that is late 19th century Great Migration, until World War II, which became kind of a cultural watershed, they carried with them three sorts of Italian music. They carried the regional music and dialect songs from their own traditions, such as these: work songs, ritual songs, love songs, lullabies. These are some beautiful images taken from the Alan Lomax expeditions in the 50s in Italy. We did an exhibition of these photographs. They were so extraordinary. So we have that. We have opera lirica. We heard a little bit about that. Enrico Caruso and other divas. And we had Neapolitan song. And these are two of the Joe's book, and Simona Frasca, some recent books on Neapolitan music. So from organ grinders and street musicians, including harpists from Viggiano, who traveled as far away, I was stunned to find this out, to Australia, to India, to Turkey. They were all over the world. And do you know the book John Zucchi wrote on Little Slaves of the Heart? I'd like to hear more about that, the shady part of that history. Mm-hmm. To concert halls, Italians filled this occupational niche throughout the diaspora and were broadly cast as a musical people. The traditional song repertoire was a more private affair, however, largely confined to family, town associations, and specific work environments, such as Genoese sailors in the Bay of San Francisco, or peasants in the Swiss colony vineyards in California. The fascist regime of the 1930s Italy made its impact on public folk festivals, staging choreographed peasants in colorful, merry old Italy-style festivities. And there's some wonderful films, if you're interested in this, Luce, Istituto Luce documentaries and propaganda films, which had diaspora crossover. And I believe this approach made a return in the multicultural heritage festivals of the 1960s and 1970s, especially in the Anglophone diaspora, the US, Canada, and Australia. And Linda Barwick talks about this in her recent volume on Italian music in Australia. It's as though the ethnic revival movement produced two estranged and contrasting musical siblings: the folk festival variety, against which folk revival performers frequently took a stand, versus the left-leaning politicized wing a la Joan Baez, Bob Dylan, or Giovanna Marini in Italy. Many diaspora music groups made their start in the 1970s. By the way, this is a history of the Italian folk revival that really needs to be written. It has not been written, the Italian musical diaspora. In Australia, we had the Italian folk music ensemble directed by University of Flinders' Antonio Comín, and its later offshoot, Gruppo La Questua. And Comín was that rare academic who knew how to make a bridge to the community, as few, in my opinion, have had the interest, ability, or knowledge to do. In New York, we have Alessandra Belloni and John La Barbera, who formed the Giullari di Piazza and helped form an entire generation of dancers, singers, and musicians. A second wave in the 1990s produced other groups, at least one as part of a specifically Salentine musical resurgence. This is the group Musicantica, and two of those musicians, by the way, have relocated to New Zealand, so they're in New Zealand now. Lorenzo Buna and Kedron Parker. We note that reclamation of family musical legacies frequently played a role for such performers, what I call the zamponia, or the bagpipe in the basement phenomenon, rediscovered, dusted off, and put back into circulation. Guitarist John La Barbera's Sicilian uncles were string instrumentalists. Australian David De Santi, a multi-band leader, folk festival director, and accordionist whose parents came from Vallo della Lucania, Campania, formed I Viaggiatori, the travelers. And Sicilian, okay, here we have another Australian group. And Sicilian singer-drummer Michela Musolino, granddaughter of a woman drummer who arrived in the US in 1915, and whose own mother was known for her drumming and folk dancing, has emerged to continue and expand this tradition. And her group is called Terra Sangue Mare, Earth, Blood, and Sea. And there are many others directly connected or merely passionate about studying and playing this music, such as David Marker, who has done a great study recently on La Zampogna in southern Italy, or teaching its dances, Celeste and Marie, while some of us instead largely conduct field research, write, and organize. I want to share just a few highlights of how I have been beating the drum or advocating for traditional culture through the Italian Oral History Institute, especially through Salentine music, with first, this was the Institute, first with this festival, Essential Salento, a festival of Salentine culture in 1998, and I believe it was the first time that a Salentine musical group directly from the Salento performed in America in the earliest iteration, the Aramire Compagnia di Musica Salentina, whose drummer, by the way, Antonio Castrignano, went on to become quite a star. He provided the soundtrack to the film Golden Door. I don't know if you've seen it here. Yeah. Together with the influential film Pizzicata, presented by the director Edoardo Winspear himself. He was in Los Angeles at the time. This was followed by what I've been told was a pivotal event for the Diaspora Music Revival. And this was a conference, festival, and publication performing ecstasies, music, dance, and ritual in the Mediterranean, which you can download for free on my website. And we went on to, so these were some of the events within that. Roberto Catalano. And we did the exhibition of the photographs, which were really quite extraordinary. And we produced this Lo Bianco, I wanted to show this to Lo Bianco, a CD on Greco, Grecanico in the Salento, of music from that area. But we didn't limit our cultural work to Salentine culture. We did all kinds of stuff on Italian Jews, on big food program, Italian Jewish food program, which was a huge success. We had the Rav from Milano, who was now in Venice, perform or sing, chant music that he had, all from the oral tradition from northern Italy. And, St. Joseph's tables, singing of the novenas, to local history, presenting the local community. So in LA at least, it's largely been in mainstream cultural institutions where touring Italian musicians in various degrees connected to roots music have been presented, such as Eugenio Bennato, Enzo Abitabile, Enerbia, Officina Zoe in the last 2 decades, but rarely in Italian-American settings. This is Ambrogio Sparagna at the San Gennaro Festival, where really it's still Sinatra and strolling musicians and dance troupes still hold sway. But we got Musicantica in there if they promised to wear costumes. So this was like a way to finesse them in. Ask an experienced folk music performer like John La Barbera, and he will tell you that frequently he's had to convince Italian Americans that this is Italian music. By the way, I think Salentine music, especially the explosive pizzica, have you all heard the pizzica form? Has achieved enormous success on the world music scene, especially as performed by the next generation musical group known as the Canzoniere Grecanico Salentino. And I think maybe for this generation, this is the pan-Italian musical identity marker, replacing the former Neapolitan music of yesterday. As an aside, I wanted you to note that the significant female niche within our diaspora folk music revival, with women leaders such as Alessandra Belloni, such as Natalie Marone, Sarah Swenson, and Michela Musolino. There's a book that's just been published called The Global Tarantella, Reinventing Southern Italian Folk Music and Dances by Incoronata in Sera that deals with this. They range from Spire dance gurus to singers of love songs to choreographers of staged political protest in all-female dance companies, such as this one. Okay. So Sarah Swenson has worked with Enzo Fina of Musicantica, and they have tended towards explicitly political dance productions, such as Femmini, a Salentine protest song about exploited women tobacco workers, and Brigantesse, women outlaws. Together with the persistence of musicians, dancers, now bloggers and journalists, as well as engaged scholars, the work of advocacy is bringing about tangible change on increasingly international platforms and transecting the diaspora. To name only a few of the scholars, we have Anna Lomax-Wood of the Association for Cultural Equity, who has been making the work of Alan Lomax widely available. And the Global Jukebox has just gone online. I don't know if you know about that. Joseph Shora at the Calandra with their public programming, publications and academic conferences. This was just last April. This was a great conference. And past work of the IOHI. So although the Institute has closed, I continue as an independent scholar. And last year, for example, we organized this conference on street performers in Palermo at the International Marionette Museum with Sergio Bonanzinga, and we're in the process of editing that volume now. This musical orphan has been adopted by a progressive and increasingly vocal segment of the diaspora intelligentsia, old and new, connecting to a more global South migration narrative. The diaspora is not only in direct contact with the center, but with its various diasporas on other continents, such as right here. And the echo effect is becoming louder. The diaspora may no longer even be on some imagined periphery in our ever more fluid and connected world. A perceptible synergy seems to be in play between older diaspora and more recent post-recession outflow of talented young Italians. It's as though Italians are finally remembering their own migration histories now that Italy has become a migrant and refugee destination, and Italians themselves are once again migrating in vast numbers, and global solidarity movements are more common. This generation is making its voice heard, building coalitions, organizing politically, and is even capable of swinging elections. An example. I had an interesting experience with the presentation of a book on migration and song, Andarsene Sognando by Eugenio Marino. So ignore the faux, naive cover. So Eugenio was the Partito Democratico secretary for Italians abroad. And frankly, I had never been asked to talk music and migrations to the brain drain. I connected the dots for them, to encourage them to recognize how much we had in common, that perhaps the psychological dynamics for immigrants, old and new, their needs, hadn't changed that much after all. We seem to be on a similar political wavelength, even though we do not always share cultural heritage, personal history, nor political battles. Sometimes this synergy can shed light on the continuing questionable priorities of Italy's political class across time, which continues to cause our diasporas. From Italy's birth as a nation in 1861, again in the aftermath of World War II, and yet again in the post-recession new millennium. The outflow of largely Southern Italians never seems to end. We are the diaspora, and our lived experiences give us a unique and valuable perspective on Italy. We are at the confluence of both the diaspora effect and what I have called the Teroni effect. The diaspora effect may be described as the power of the periphery to impact the center. This occurs also with music. If we consider some of the earliest recordings of traditional music, and that has been dealt with by Todd Cambio, or immigrants' reshaping of folk festivals in Italy, or today as we provide an echo chamber in audiences for the touring Italian musicians, or at least in part a result of the terrain being prepared by the diaspora search for its own cultural roots. And as for the Teroni effect, terone, of course, is a derogatory term for southern Italian peasants, terra, dirt, earth. Here's a contemporary example of a cultural confluence between migrant generations played out in the diaspora through folk music. Teroni was a critical volume written by journalist Pino Aprile in 2010. And it was translated, if you want to read it in Italian, in English by Bordighera Press. And it immediately produced a huge backlash, as you can see by these other publications. It contested the official narrative of the unification of Italy, whose 150th anniversary was being celebrated in 2011, positing instead that it had proved disastrous for the Italian South, and that it actually gave rise to one of the largest exoduses in human history. This new take on the origins of the nation gave us a framing context we simply did not previously have. Musicantica and Vox Dance Theater, also contesting the celebrations, and fueled by this Teroni narrative, staged a piece on brigands in Brigantesse, making links for the audience to the current plight of global migrants and refugees, as well as spelling out the recurring political and economic factors which continue to cause human dispersals. I think we are only beginning to see where the act of cultural remembering can lead, and what sorts of musical culture it might produce in the diaspora. The access may even be shifting as Italy dismantles its own memory of folk culture, diminishing the academic base of these studies and places of practice. We've heard, for example, of the many languishing sound archives and of the very few and dwindling university positions in ethnology and folk traditions. Those involved in folk music revivals, the 1960s and the 1990s, and here I'm coming to the end, have always proved to have a heightened political consciousness of the forces at play in history, Italian and otherwise, and they have skillfully used music as a powerful means of publicly speaking and singing about them, now perhaps more virtually, now directly linking center and peripheries and multiple peripheries to each other. I have no doubt that you'll be hearing more from the Italian diaspora, finding its more numerous voices, speaking out, performing, and organizing. So I encourage all of you to keep beating those drums. If you're interested in part of what I said, it's in these publications. This was a conference we had in Los Angeles in 2005. A very important book just published by Plastino on the folk music revival, mostly in Italy, however. And we have donated our collection of traditional songs to the UCLA Ethnomusicology Archive. So if you ever need to go and consult these recordings, you can go there. That's it. Thank you.